Today we're going to talk about headphone measurements. You got a big head? We got big headphones. The size of your noggin is going to play a critical role.
No. Ricky, those aren't the kind of measurements I want to talk about.
Right. Headphone measurements don't mean what headphone best fits your head. Well, I mean, actually, it kind of does, like depending on how it sounds and your listening preference. I mean, see, I wasn't that far off. I digress. Drew Baird, PE, CEO, and founder of Moon Audio is here today to talk to us about headphone measurements and why they don't matter, at least in the grand scheme of things. The people have questions, Drew, so let's just get to them. Question 1, what is a headphone measurement and what is it measuring?
So the reason we're talking about this topic today is I have seen, as of late, a lot of reviewers basing the sound signatures and the performance of a headphone based on measurements that they're doing. And while measurements are a very important tool to be used to look at things like, rolled off high frequencies, too much bloom in the mid-range, too much bass, too little bass, and so forth, the bottom line is there's no way to really get an understanding of what a headphone sounds like by just doing measurements. And the people at Audio Precision and Head Acoustics are these dummy heads with microphones, and they've got inserts for ears that actually try and mimic the skin on our heads, the softness that takes care of reflections, taking care of angles, high tech, the Audio Precision equipment, extremely expensive measurement equipment, and people like Jude Mansell at Headphone have this setup, which is uber expensive. Well, there are a lot of folks on YouTube and writing blogs that are using makeshift measurement studios in their house with pieces of cardboard and microphones. I'm going off the extreme here, right? But they're not using to the level of quality like Jude is and some of the really high-end measurement folks are using. And so this can really paint a bad picture on what potentially a headphone can measure like, as well as sound like, right? If there are all kinds of things like you don't want to have leakage and you want to do it in an anechoic chamber and you want to make sure that you account for angles of the drivers. And, I'm not going to get into all the technical, details. And, I would highly recommend go to Headphone. Jude has a wonderful video where he meets with Head Acoustics and goes over a lot of this really detailed stuff. But at the end of the day, it is very important to note that two headphones can have, and I'm not going to say the measurements on these two headphones we have right here can be similar, but sound very different.
Right.
The bottom line is when you put on these two different headphones, and these two different headphones, one's a little more forward and analytical, one's a little warmer. For the sake of argument, maybe their frequency responses are close, but is that frequency response really going to pick up on these things? The coloration, the depth of the sound stage, the airiness, all of these things. That frequency response just can't do that. It's going to give you a basic set of, it does frequency from here to there, and here are some dips and peaks. But at the same time, you can't just go on a measurement, and you can't do a review that solely bases the performance of a headphone on a measurement. At the end of the day, you've got to listen to it.
So the headphone measurement itself is just a graph? I mean, what is it measuring?
So we're measuring the frequency response from A to B, we'll just say for simplicity, 20 hertz to 20K kilohertz. And it's going to tell you some things like, this headphone has a V-shape. Well, I know from V-shape, those tend to have a funner sound, but that still isn't going to tell me, do I like the sound of that headphone? Because every ear canal, every eardrum is different like a fingerprint. No two are the same. There's also no right or wrong. We perceive sounds of headphones differently between me and you. You may like one headphone and I don't like that exact same headphone. So how did we figure out from that measurement that you liked it and I didn't? You don't. You've got to listen to it because it's just not going to go into enough detail. Like I said, it can tell you where there's a really trebly peak and a headphone that'll be really sibilant that you're not going to like, nobody's going to like, or if it's really rolled off on the bottom end, and you want some bass, well, maybe I'll pass on that headphone and look at some other graphs as a tool to figure out, okay, I want a V-shaped frequency curve, I want a fun sounding curve.
Right.
This looks to be one of those headphones. Let me now go listen to it, right?
Interesting. Yeah. So let's put up on screen here what a sample headphone measurement graph kind of looks like. Drew, help us interpret basically what we're seeing here. How do you read this measurement?
So this frequency graph, this is what I was sort of talking about earlier, that has a real serious spike at around 4 or 5K. And this is where I know there's a sibilance issue. So this is sort of the thing you want to look for, that, hey, this might be a problematic headphone. You know, they didn't take care of this, and they could have probably taken care of this by, you know, dealing with some of the reflections, because that's what usually causes a very sharp spike like this. But essentially this graph, if you look outside of that spike, is essentially telling you how far it's going to go on the high frequencies, how far it's going to go on the low frequencies, whether it's got a recessed mid-range, and so forth. So again, use this as a tool, but not as a way to measure how good that headphone is in terms of whether you like it or not. Because this headphone that did have that one spike, actually everything outside that spike, it was a wonderful sounding headphone.
Yeah.
And if the headphone manufacturer just would have fixed that one spike, it would have been a fantastic seller. But because of it, killed it. So.
Interesting. Okay, so essentially, why would different headphones have different measurements? I mean, what affects the sound or the measurement of that headphone?
So, you know, every driver has different feel small parameters, impedances, resistance, etc. Each driver likes to either be in an open or a closed back environment in terms of the enclosure. That essentially will also create different things like, you know, an open back headphone, like we say, has usually a wider sound stage, a closed back, more, you know, closed in. The frequency graph won't do a great job of telling you about that. You've got to listen to it. But things like, I was talking about reflections, you know, ear pads on the headphones can absorb some reflections. They can help take care of those trebly peaks. Right. The materials used in the enclosure changes the tonality. The more you can take care of, frequency waves are obviously bouncing all over the place inside the chamber of the headphone. And if it's open or closed, that can change the way whether they bounce back at your ear or bounce outside of the headphone. Okay. And this changes the tonality. And then things that you can look at are size of drivers. That can, you know, the larger the driver, the HE1000 SE and V2 by Hi-Fi Man, they have enormous drivers. And one thing that they do so well is they will get super down in the subharmonic bass frequencies. And I don't mean big bloated bass, but I mean they can get down lower than a lot of headphones because the driver is so large. So different materials come into play, whether it's a dynamic driver, a planar driver, the shape of the driver, all of these things, dampening, all of these things can play a role in how that headphone is going to measure and the frequency response that you're going to get.
Interesting. Why do you think, or why do people put so much stock into this graph? You know, they think, they read this and that tells them everything they need to know about a headphone. Why?
Yeah, I don't know, honestly. It's quite confusing, and I've seen a lot of it lately on YouTube and other places. Maybe it's the fact that they don't have the headphones for a long period of time. They don't have time to burn them in. They don't have time to live with them. They don't have time to live with them in other products that they have. Maybe because either they borrowed them from a manufacturer, or they're just going with the norm because they see so many other people that are looking at measurements and basing whether the headphone is good or not, so they think that's the way to do it. I'm going to tell you, in my experience, and this isn't just about headphones, but this is about amplifiers, our cables. Sure, numbers are important, but at the end of the day, does it sound good? And really at that point, the measurements don't matter. Case in point, here's a tube headphone amp. Well, tube headphone amps have a lot of distortion in it. Well, if you just looked at a tube headphone amp and you said, hey, this has distortion, it's not gonna sound good. Yeah. Well, guess what? A tube headphone amp gets its sound quality, its romantic, warm sounding feeling from that distortion. So distortion in this situation is a good thing. Now, distortion in a headphone may not be a good thing. Right. Most headphones these days, you know, don't have a whole lot of distortion. But if you're looking at like a phone and you're using the speaker on the phone itself, you know, it's a teeny driver, right? And if you play it really loud, it's going to distort and you're going to get distortion. Yeah. It's going to sound bad. I don't really base a lot of a weight on headphone distortion because most good headphones are going to have low distortion numbers. And the same thing, like I said, with tube amps. I don't worry about it. Getting to equipment, making sure that you measure the equipment properly. And you know, I've seen some reviewers, you know, working on not just headphones, but going off of measurements on equipment, and they weren't intended the way they were supposed to. Don't put all of your stock into a frequency response or the numbers or the measurements. At the end of the day, the bottom line is, how does it sound to your ears?
So you were saying something, I want to get back to something you were saying earlier. You were saying things like soundstage and imaging. I mean, resolution. Are these things that, can they measure these things?
So not simple measurement techniques, okay? So, and what I mean by that is less expensive rigs that do-it-yourselfers are doing, and so forth. I'll digress back to that video that Drew did, where Head Acoustics is getting into being able to measure beyond the eardrum, more to what's going on with the cochlear, okay? And they're now doing measurements on 3 different things, not just the frequency, but they're also doing the distortion. Again, don't put a lot of weight into that one because the distortion levels are low, but they're also doing a technique where they're calling QDAC, where essentially they're measuring, okay, does this headphone have a sense of soundstage? And how they're doing it is looking at time domain differences between the left and right ear. So they're measuring both ears at the same time. They're not just measuring one driver. So they're equally being looked at. So real expensive rigs like this are getting closer to understanding and telling you, okay, is this going to have an airier, bigger presentation? But still, at the end of the day, until you listen to the headphone, that's not going to tell you anything either. Right. It's a tool to see what a headphone can do.
It's just a tool.
It's just a tool.
So we've already mentioned it, but just to make it clear and to beat a dead horse, what's the best way for people to check the sound of a headphone?
Well, there's lots of different ways. I'd recommend coming to our booth at the shows that we do. We do some can jams, we do Axpona. We rotate shows every year, so just check us out on Facebook and Instagram. We post, what shows we're going to be at for the year. Come into stores and demo, like Moon Audio. We do private appointments here where you can sit back and listen for 8 hours to a pair of headphones by yourself in a demo room. Obviously, if you're in Nebraska in the middle of nowhere and you've got no stores, we've got a 30-day return policy on our headphones. Buy a pair, check them out, send them back for a store credit. Make sure to check out moon-audio.com for lots of written reviews, lots of FAQs. Our videos are hosted there as well as on our YouTube channel. So use these as a way to sort of gauge, that headphone sounds interesting and it may be tailored towards the sound I think I want. Then again, try that headphone.
Or if you have questions, you could always drop a comment.
Yep, drop a comment.
Call us, email us,
Shoot us an email through our ticketing system. I'm gonna give you, I'm gonna ask a lot of different questions, sort of a concierge service of, what kind of music do you listen to? Where do you listen to it? Is this on the go, home office? Do you have to have isolation? We're gonna weed out 90% of the questions that you have, except the last one is whether you like it, like the sound. And you're gonna have to just try that for yourself.
For sure. Are there any other thoughts on headphone measurements and how we can tell how something sounds?
Yeah, I mean, going back to summarize a little bit, look for things that are important to you. Do you want bass frequencies? So look at the frequency graph at the lower frequencies. Do they have a nice, bell-shaped curve that gives you some oomph at the bottom end? Are you sensitive to high frequencies? Look at the top side of the frequency graph. Does it shoot up on the frequency graph? Do you want more vocals? Look at the mid-range. Is the mid-range really recessed compared to the treble and the bass? Then, the vocals aren't going to be as prominent. Look for those spikes. They'll usually really stand out, and most headphone manufacturers will get rid of those. But there can be, if you're sensitive to sibilance, look in the 4 or 5K range. See if there are some weird treble peaks, or frequency peaks, not treble peaks, in that area. Make sure to also check out a reputable source that has a really good measurement system. We know Headphi's got one of the, one of the world's best. I know they're working on a library and a tool, a wiki on their website that you can put in a manufacturer, a brand of headphone. If they've measured it, they're going to have frequency graphs. I know they're still working knee deep in the coding for that. But yeah, that's really important.
All excellent points. Thank you so much for the insight, Drew. Remember, headphone measurements are just one piece of the puzzle. The best way to check out how a headphone sounds is by simply testing it out, which is why we have people scheduling demos all the time here at Moon Audio. Call up your local hi-fi music shop and see if you can try something out. If not, you can always check our reviews on the site here, or of course, call us. Don't rely on a shiny looking graph to give you all the information, because it can't.
So if you like this video, be sure to give a thumbs up and remember to subscribe for more audiophile content just like this. If you have any questions, drop a comment below, and as always, thanks for watching.